short and sweet. Chrystia Freeland is a well-respected journalist, author, and very recently a very active politician. She was born in Peace River, Alberta, and has lived in many parts of the world, including Ukraine and Russia. Her formal education includes Harvard University, St. Anthony's College at Oxford, and also the United World College of the Adriatic at the University of Oxford as well. Deputy editor of the Globe and Mail. She's also held various positions at the Financial Times, ranging from the Moscow bureau chief to the U.S. managing editor. She's a self-proclaimed Ukrainian activist, and she's written extensively in various articles and a couple of books. She's the author of Sale of the Century, a book about Russia's transition from communism to capitalism. And she's also authored the award-winning book, Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super-Rich and the Fall of Everybody Else. Since 2013, Chrystia has been a member of Canada's Parliament, representing Toronto Centre in the House of Commons, and is currently the Liberal Party critic for trade. If you haven't read her article, My Ukraine, in the Brookings essays, you really should. I'm not sure whether I should introduce both, or let Chrystia speak first. Both. Marc Garneau. Marc was born in Quebec City, where he undertook his early education. He went on to the Kingston to do an engineering degree at the Royal Military College in 1970. And in 1973, he went over to London, England, where he received a doctorate in electrical engineering from the Imperial College of Science and Technology. The following year, 1974, he returned to begin 15 years of service in the Canadian Navy, retiring as a naval captain 15 years later in 1989. During that time, Marc made history. He became the first Canadian astronaut to fly in space in 1984. He joined NASA's Johnson Space Center in 1992, and then made 2 more space flights. In all, Marc Garneau has logged over 677 hours in space. You could say that space was in his blood, so it makes some sense that Canada called upon him to become the president of the Canadian Space Agency. And again, a couple of years after that, Canada honored him again in 2003 when Marc was made a Companion of the Order of Canada. That is Canada's highest civilian honor. Marc's deep sense of duty to serve his country led him to also pursue a career in politics. In 2008, he became elected as the Member of Parliament for Westmount Ville-Marie in Quebec. Re-elected in May 2011. Today, he's the Liberal critic for Foreign Affairs, International Trade, and La Francophonie. And as the Foreign Affairs critic, he continues to work closely with Liberal leader Justin Trudeau and colleagues like Chrystia Freeland during the crisis in Ukraine. And as recently as April 29, he was standing in the House of Commons talking about his observations and what is happening in Ukraine at this point in time. I bring to you a very warm welcome. Vitaimo, both Marc and Chrystia. Over to you.
Thank you.
Дякую вам дуже приємно мені тут бути сьогодні вечором. And I'm glad our timing is perfect because my aunt Larissa Blavatska has just arrived. I didn't want to start without Larissa. Larissa, I know, is known to everyone in the Hromada, and in addition to being a very distinguished Canadian diplomat with a long career of service, including in Ukraine, Larissa now supplies my home away from home in Ottawa. And every night we have a cup of tea at the end of the day and discuss parliamentary affairs. So, дякую дуже, Larissa. I wanted to just make a few quick points about how I see the situation in Ukraine, and then I hope we'll have time for a discussion. So, point 1, which I think is well known to our Hromada, but maybe not so fully understood outside it, is it's really important to understand the conflict in Ukraine not as an ethnic conflict, not as an internal Ukrainian civil war, but as an ideological battle about political values. The Ukrainians in Ukraine call this their dignity revolution, and that is exactly what it has been. It's an accident of history and geography that this internal Ukrainian struggle for democracy has sort of metastasized into this geopolitical fight with Russia. I emphasize that because I think there is a very powerful sort of Russian propaganda effort to frame the struggle in precisely the opposite way, to see this as an internal Ukrainian war between so-called Russians and Ukrainians inside Ukraine. And it's really important, I think sometimes maybe even our Roma that doesn't, sort of fully see this, it's really important to understand the extent to which those issues don't really exist in Ukraine in the way they are sometimes portrayed outside. Ukraine is a truly bilingual country. People who have lived and worked there know in Parliament the debates are conducted in Ukrainian and in Russian without translation, because the assumption is, and the reality is, everybody understands both languages. On television, you have interviews where one person is speaking Russian, one person is speaking Ukrainian. Again, because everybody understands both. A little sort of anecdote I like to tell to illustrate this sort of, really flowing, really fluid linguistic situation is to point out that Petro Poroshenko, and I asked him this myself to confirm it, he did not start speaking Ukrainian until 1996, when he was elected president of Ukraine. This is the post-Maidan president of Ukraine. And the language in his home is Russian. His wife doesn't really speak Ukrainian, she understands it. So the linguistic situation is much more fluid than is usually depicted. I think that Russians don't even really appreciate how fluid it is, because Russians who come from Russia into Ukraine, they don't understand Ukrainian. And so they feel a kind of level of enmity which just isn't there. I wanted just to give some illustration of this reality. I just wanted to cite a little bit of polling data, just again because it is helpful for people to have these facts at your fingertips to counter some of the more stereotypical depictions of Ukraine. So this is polling data which was done by the Cave International Institute of Sociology. This is a very internationally respected polling center. And they did it in April of last year, so after the Maidan, before the election, before the presidential election, after the invasion of Crimea, but before the real war in the Donbass had started. And in polling that they did in the south and east of Ukraine, in the so-called Novorossiya, in the most Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, 76.8% of respondents were opposed to the seizure of government buildings by the separatists. Only 11.7% supported. I'm emphasizing, this is in the south and the east. This is not Halachina, this is not Kyiv. Nearly 70% were opposed to unification with Russia, and only 15.4% were in favor. Again, this is the east and the south. 87.7% said Ukraine should decide its own internal affairs, including its constitutional structure, entirely on its own, without interference of any outside powers, particularly Russia. And then an interesting point, 71.5% said the rights of Russian speakers were not under any threat in Ukraine. What's also interesting, and I have observed in traveling to Ukraine, I'm sure other people who have been traveling to Ukraine will have found, and the polling data confirms, is what I have observed is since the Russian invasion, it has actually paradoxically served as a unifying force in Ukraine. And it has shifted the attitudes, particularly Kyiv and Lviv were already very strongly united around the idea of a political Ukrainian identity. But since the invasion, you've seen a real shift, especially in the south and the east, towards embracing this notion of a political Ukrainian identity people were rallying around. And so to give you, again, just a few data points, this is from, and by the way, also a growing hostility towards Russia, which wasn't there before. I mean, Ukrainians are very practical people in the same way that we as Canadians might sometimes resent the bigness of the United States. We understand we need a working relationship with America. And I've always found Ukrainians to be like that. This struggle has really shifted things in Ukraine. So this is, again, this is from that same Cave Institute of Sociology polling data. And this is polling that they did both before the Maidan and after about attitudes towards Russia. So September 2013, between September 2013 and February 2015, they asked people, what is your attitude towards Russia? Is it positive or negative? In September 2013, just before the Maidan started, 88% of Ukrainians had a positive attitude towards Russia. Ukrainians wanted to have a good relationship. By February of 2015, that had fallen to 34%. So I have a lot of Ukrainian friends who will say to me that sort of the irony is, they say that Yanukovych built Ukrainian democracy because it was built in opposition to him, and that Putin is building Ukrainian national identity because it is being built in opposition to him. And although, you know, that's sort of almost horrible to say those words, there's some truth to it. What's interesting is the breakdown in those attitudes. Not surprisingly, Western Ukraine has gone down to the most negative attitude towards Russia. But even in Western Ukraine, September 2013, 75% said, yes, I have a positive attitude towards Russia. By February of this year, that was down to 15%. Here's what's really interesting. In Eastern Ukraine, so, you know, they can't do polling right now in the Donbass itself, but all those Eastern Oblasti, in September 2013, 96% said they had a positive attitude towards Russia. By February 2015, that had fallen to 55%. So there's a real shift across the country. That's one point I wanted to talk about. A second issue that I think is really important to understand is the extent to which, and this is my own personal view, I'm happy to have a debate about it, I really see from Putin and the Kremlin the motivation being around the danger of the Ukrainian demonstration effect. The fear that the Kremlin has, where there is, you know, a Yanukovych-style authoritarian kleptocracy, the fear that a successful, democratic, prosperous, rule of law Ukraine will give the Russians some ideas. And, you know, this is something, whenever I talk to Russian Democrats, and there are still a few, and in some ways these are the people I feel the most sorry for, they say, that's what Putin is scared of. And this is sort of the irony for Putin, that the more he claims a Russian kinship with Ukraine, the more Ukraine becomes dangerous for him. Because the more he says to Russians, hey, Ukrainians and Russians are the same, and Russians look across the border and see Ukrainians actually willing to die for democracy, you know, then this notion that somehow Russia is genetically predisposed to always live under the iron boot, it doesn't work so well. And I think it's important to bear that motivation in mind, and also really important, and I think this is something that we as a Hromada can do, we as a country can do, to create space and create a dialogue with those Russian Democrats who are still there. They are being relentlessly squeezed in Russia. These are people who really need support. A lot of them are fleeing to Ukraine. Most of my Russian journalist friends from the 90s are now working in Ukraine. And these are people who I think we need to be listening to, building contacts with, supporting. Third point that I wanted to make, and people who've been working directly with the Ukrainian government will make this more eloquently than I will. But, you know, it's easy to despair about the state of Ukraine. My view as someone who has been, I first visited Ukraine in 1980. I actually was a student at Kyiv University between 88 and 89. This Ukrainian government is so much better than any government Ukraine has ever had, I would probably say, in its millennial history. No, these guys are not angels. Yes, they face many challenges, but they're really very good. And, you know, the fact that they did something like put Natalie Uresko, an American, as Minister of Finance, for one thing, she's terrific, But what you're also saying as Poroshenko and as the Rada in doing that is you're saying, I'm not going to let the Ministry of Finance be my corrupt bank account for me and my friends. I'm officially and openly cutting myself off from those sources of revenue. And that's a big deal. Of course, I think it's really important to continue monitoring Ukraine, and by the way, Ukrainian civil society is doing a terrific job of that. If you ever think that Western articles critical of the Ukrainian government are maybe too critical, read the Ukrainian press. I mean, the Ukrainians are so demanding of their government, and I think that's really good. But I emphasize this because I really think the most important battleground for Ukraine right now is economic reform. And Ukraine has a bit of a shot now. You know, there is some Western support. I wish it were more massive. But it's there. There's goodwill. The Europeans have said they will do the trade deal by the end of the year. There is an opportunity. And if Ukraine can get through that, I think there is a really, I think that's the most important thing, much more important than specific border issues. If the economy can start to grow, if you can start to end this corrupt kleptocracy and start having real opportunities, that's going to be what brings people together and makes, being Ukrainian and being part of the Ukrainian project be something that Ukrainians really want. By the way, I think that Putin gets this as well. And I think that what we should be most concerned about when it comes to people seeking to undermine Ukraine is going to be Russian efforts to undermine the Ukrainian economic reform effort. And then just a final point about our Hromada, and I'm speaking now as a Ukrainian Canadian and also as a politician. I think it's really important, I think two things are important. The first is, our Hromada is incredibly effective. And now speaking as a politician, I just want to say thank you to all the activists in the Hromada who do such a great job of making the voices of Ukrainian Canadians heard. I mean, we pay attention. I'm Ukrainian, so I always was going to be sympathetic to Ukraine. But it's been interesting for me and kind of really great to see the extent to which MPs from all parties, they know they need to care about Ukraine. That's a great thing. But the second thing I would say is, I think it's really important for us not to let the Ukraine issue be ghettoized, and not to let policy towards Ukraine be framed as the special, unique, sort of boutique interest of the Ukrainian Canadian community and of Ukrainian Canadian voters. That is a path to nowhere for us. It's really important for us as people who know Ukraine best, and I think can advocate for it most effectively, to have a deep understanding of what's happening in Ukraine, and to talk about the value of supporting Ukrainian democracy for a successful Europe and for a successful international order. It's not just Ukrainian voters who should care about Ukraine. It's anyone who cares about a peaceful world. So those are my kind of introductory thoughts. I'm sure that Marc, who by the way has been working incredibly hard on a zillion foreign policy files, but really specifically devoting a huge amount of work to Ukraine. I've been very impressed at his level of knowledge and very grateful for it, and his sort of bringing it up and pushing the issue in the caucus, and I'm eager to hear his comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chrystia, and we're really here mainly to answer your questions, but I do want to say that within the Liberal Party we're very fortunate to have somebody like Chrystia who has an intimate and in-depth understanding of this very, very complex issue. I'll only very quickly address one thing, and that is because many people ask, what is the Liberal Party's position in terms of the actions that the Government of Canada has taken? The reality is that in terms of the initiatives that have been taken by the Government of Canada, whether we're talking about economic sanctions, whether we're talking about providing financial loans, whether we're talking about providing some equipment, whether we're talking about providing the NATO, a contribution to the NATO reassurance mission, whether we're talking about providing soldiers to train Ukrainian army soldiers in the western part of Ukraine. The Liberal Party's position has been supportive of the government of Canada. And, you know, you're quite right to ask the question, because we may appear to be somewhat invisible, and the reason is because we have supported the positions that the government of Canada has put forward up to this point. We have, in some cases, made some additional suggestions. We have actually suggested that certain individuals, Russians, should be on the sanctions list. And in fact, that has not happened, but we have provided some additional names of Russians that we feel should be on that list. We have raised the issue of SWIFT. SWIFT, of course, as you know, is the international banking system. It's been applied very effectively in the case of Iran, and essentially has had a major effect on their ability to trade and do commerce with the rest of the world. It's a very major decision to decide whether to step up to SWIFT, and it does involve many other countries deciding whether they're ready to go along with it, and particularly countries who may have a high level of trade going on with Russia at the moment. So it's certainly not an easy thing, but in terms of economic sanctions, it is something that should not be off the table. So we've made those kinds of suggestions. We've even said that Canada should contribute to providing some vehicles for the OSCE, which is tasked with monitoring the situation in the Donbass. A very difficult job, and for which they're not necessarily properly equipped. So we've talked about Canada helping to finance armored personnel vehicles so that they can go around with a greater degree of safety. These are relatively small differences between our parties, but I just wanted you to know that the Liberal Party position has been very much along the lines of the position taken by the Conservative government. Having said that, I'll be quiet, and I think Chrystia and I would be pleased to try to answer some of the questions that you have.
Since
Yes.
Okay, just excuse me, I'd like to thank you, and actually Boris is going to be the facilitator of these questions.
Okay.
Because that's what it says right here, Boris. Okay? All right?
sure, why not?
All right, okay, so let's look, okay.
Quick thank you. Since both of you have to
Okay.
first, we have to thank you very quickly. First of all, we have to mention the historic element of this occasion. It's the first time in 15 years we've had more than one MP speaking to us. We have to thank Mr. Garneau, who convinced Ms. Freeland to come along and speak to us.
And who invited me, so thank you very much.
Exactly. The second is, this is the first time one of our speakers has given us a homework assignment. All of you received the email asking you to read the article in the Brookings essay, Mr. Freeland. Have a look at it, read it, look at the margins on the right, with the maps on the data of people's opinion, political activities, and so forth. Really worthwhile having a look at. And now to the core of the issue. We have to thank, I think as a community, the Liberal Party of Canada in general, because the first person to stand up in December of 2013 and suggest and urge the government to aid Ukraine was Ralph Goodale,
Yes,
for Canada. Since then, as Mr. Garneau listed, the Liberal Party has both supported the government's actions and pushed the government to take further actions, especially when it comes to sanctions against people like Chrystia and senior members of Putin's elite. So for that, for your continual support, we thank you. And lastly, we have to thank you for rushing like mad from Parliament Hill, running into a sweaty pub basement, and taking the time to speak to us and then answer questions in 3 minutes. For all of that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, by the way, there is a microphone behind you. Do you want to control the questions, or do you want us to?
Oh, why don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Somebody raises their hand.
Hands up, questions, run.
Mr. Garneau, Ms. Freeland, one of the issues which the West
Stand
has,
up, please.
one of the issues which the West has not really dealt with is either lethal defensive or offensive weapons. Putin is sending tons of ammunition. They get Ukrainian positions, despite Minsk 2 are being shelled every day. There's at least one Ukrainian killed on the average, they're getting pasted to death. When is the West going to have either lethal offensive or defensive weapons? And what is the position of the Liberal Party on that point?
I'll start and then maybe Mark.
Sure.
I was going to say correct me, but I hope
No,
you won't
no.
need to. Actually, and I'll just talk. You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
So look, the issue of supplying defensive arms to Ukraine is something we are actively debating in our caucus. We have been talking about it, and the government, I know, is also actively debating it. We were immediately supportive of the Canadian military trainers in Ukraine. I think that's absolutely right, and Justin Trudeau came out immediately and explicitly in favor. I think it's something we need to keep discussing. I would say, and I think this is very important for the community to take on board, I really think at this point, the real fight for Ukraine's future is on the economic front. The central issue is issues like debt forgiveness. Larry Stevens wrote a great op-ed about this, arguing in favor of it. And I would add that then the Russian debt should be labeled odious debt. To me, I agree, Ukrainians are dying. I would say it's more than one. It's like more like 4 or 5 every day. But if Ukraine can get through the next year economically, and the West can do a huge amount to support Ukraine there, I think that should be the political priority of Western governments and the political priority of our community.
No, I think that's good.
I take it that means a frozen war in Ukraine for ever and ever. There is no supply. Lethal or lethal defensive or that means a frozen war, does it not?
Well, as Chrystia said, we believe that one of the tools that may eventually work, it does take time, it worked in the case of Iran, is the economic sanctions front. Those are things that take a while to bite. Even if Mr. Putin says, no, it's not having any effect, we know that it is having an effect, and he's himself admitted that the GDP of the country could drop by 4 or 5%. Now, part of that is related to the price of oil, but part of it is also related to the sanctions that have been imposed. So those sanctions are having an effect, and in the long run, it will be difficult for him to conceal from the Russian people that there is an effect that is occurring because of that. And that can be a very powerful motivator for action to be taken in terms of a changed position with respect to Russia. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about the military side of things. It is a big step. It's an escalation. It's viewed in different ways, and at the moment, I think that if we continue to show the resolve that the West is showing, and I think there is a considerable amount of resolve, and I think there's still a considerable amount of maneuvering room for us to ramp things up, I think that eventually that message will get across, and that we won't be stuck with a situation of a frozen war.
And I would add just 2 things about that. Look, it's very important for all of us as people engaged with Ukraine to be aware of how fluid the situation is on the ground. And I think something very interesting is happening, and this is based on talking to Ukrainian politicians and journalists and sort of civic society people. I think something very interesting is happening with the Donbass. I think sort of the paradox of the Donbass right now is actually the political fight between Ukraine and Russia is not over who gets to have the Donbass, it's over who gets to not have the Donbass. It's like the ransom of Red Chief. They're sort of trying to push the Donbass to the other party. And you know, the struggle right now, you know, the Ukrainians, I think quite rightly, are insisting to not be left with de jure control over the Donbass, but not have de facto control. And really that is where the political battle is. Because the Donbass is very expensive to support, and really sort of the political structures there have been decimated. So I think a lot is going to hinge on that sort of political struggle and those political negotiations. And what we need is for the Western sort of Normandy group participants in those struggles to be really subtle and aware of a situation which I think is the Russian goal, in which Ukraine is left having to pay for the Donbass, having Donbass voters inside Ukraine, but having no real effective military control of the territory or of the border. I think that's actually Putin's dream scenario right now. And it's not so much, you know, I'm now going to quote George Soros, but he has this great line where he says, the struggle before was Russian hybrid war, and he says now it's moved into hybrid peace. And I think that characterizes the situation well. But the second point I would make on the military front is, I think it is very important, as Marc said, for there to be an understanding in the Kremlin that the possibility of escalation from the West exists and it is real. For me, Mariupol is very important. There have been so many days when I thought the May 9th Victory Day thing might be the attack on Mariupol. So far it hasn't happened. I'm not going to make any predictions because Putin continues to surprise. But the fact that he hasn't gone for Mariupol so far, I think is very much, I think it's because of two things. One, the Ukrainian resistance has been much more forceful than the Russians expected. But secondly, I think that the Kremlin understands, were they to go for Mariupol, they would be hit with much harder Western response. And I think it's important to keep that discussion alive.
I agree with you in terms of the economy, the importance of the economic front. The other front I'd like to mention as a journalist is the propaganda war and the tremendous resource investment the Russians have, the power of that. Now, what struck me a few months ago when I was watching some BBC stuff on the web is suddenly I came away with the impression as a Westerner was that this is really that lovely civil war that Russians would like to kill because they become entrapped. And now on one hand, the Ukrainian government doesn't allow journalists to report those once you're getting a one-sided view. But one question I have for you is as a journalist, how does the West combat the propaganda machine? Because it is a very powerful one, and that is very effective because they have a great, powerful history behind it. They have a proven track record. I mean, people who know the system know where it's coming from, but don't know the system and by it will climb the same.
I think it's a great question, and I really agree. I gave a talk last week during our break week in Washington at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and there were lots of kind of State Department and Pentagon people there, and this was one of their chief concerns. They describe it as the weaponization of information. How do we combat it? Well, for one thing, I think we do need to, and money will be an issue, get back into, you know, the Radio Free Europe age. You know, that was really useful, and I think there does need to be some Western government-funded sources of information, and we should be investing in that. Some of the Western embassies are doing a good job. Canada at NATO is really effective. But I think that there needs to be a much more concerted effort, partly for Western publics, but also for Russian-speaking audiences in the former Soviet Union. You know, when you talk to, I talk sometimes to President Ilves of Estonia, and he says that Russian speakers in Estonia tend to think that Russia has a right to Crimea and the Donbass. And these are Estonian citizens. These are citizens of the EU. And he says, why do you think that? And they say that's what we hear on television all the time. So I do think there needs to be a Western investment. The other thing I would say, and I think it's something that the Ukrainian-Canadian community can be part of, the Ukrainian civil society in Ukraine is truly remarkable right now. And one of the things that they're doing, not as effectively as the Kremlin because they don't have as much money, but really effectively, is communications. And I think we should be supporting them. And to give you one example of really smart kind of crowd-funded things that are happening, around the World War II commemorations, there was this crowd-funded couple of videos, each a minute long, that went viral. They had an Israeli-Ukrainian director, and they had two famous actors from Soviet World War II films, an older woman and an older man. And they had a young woman, it was all in Russian, and it had the older woman putting on her old uniform, putting on all her medals in that sort of very Soviet way, and talking about her World War II service in the Soviet Army, in the Red Army. And then her granddaughter came, speaking in Russian, and said, "I'm so proud of you, my grandmother. You have inspired me to go fight in the ATO, and I'm going to serve as a nurse." And then they had another actor, these were like famous actors for Ukrainians, an older man, and the same thing, and it was, you know, the actor said it's his grandson, and he said, "Your service in the Red Army has inspired me to serve and fight in the ATO." And that was very, very powerful because it's part of this, I think, essential Ukrainian effort to claim the history of Soviet Ukraine and say that's part of who we are. I just cite that as an example of there are lots of really cool little crowd-funded things Ukrainians are doing, and insofar as we can, we should be helping them, both as a community and I would say Western governments should.
Yeah, and you raise a very, very important point. In a different context in the war in Iraq and Syria, the same arguments have been presented, that ISIS has been very effective in terms of its propaganda war, in terms of attracting recruits and what have you, and that we in the West should also put in special efforts to try to counter that, because at the moment it's allowed them to keep replenishing their recruitment base and to keep the movement going at a very healthy speed and bringing in financing and other things. So the propaganda war is an important element in all of this, no question.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and especially the outline of the Liberal Party's views. Actually, I was a little surprised by the January 28th press release that both of you and Ralph Goodale issued. It was very supportive of Ukraine, but there was no mention that the leader of the party, Justin Trudeau, also endorses those views. So I was surprised about that. And my second question is, as you know, Putin is establishing military bases in the new Siberian islands. They are actually a threat to Canada and our sovereignty in the Arctic. What is the Liberal Party's position about strengthening Canada's military defense?
Let me have a go at that. Justin Trudeau absolutely endorses the position that we expressed, Chrystia, Ralph and I, last January, and every other position that we've discussed this evening. Listen, the basic fundamentals here is that Ukrainian sovereignty has been violated. That's reducing it to its simplest element. No country has a right to violate the sovereignty of Ukraine. We've seen it in Crimea, we're seeing it in the eastern part of Ukraine. That is unacceptable to a country like Canada, which believes very strongly that Ukraine must be free to choose its destiny. That's the fundamental driver behind this whole thing. Mr. Putin, in the north, in the Arctic, as many countries are jockeying for position because of the possibility of vast resources, are posturing. There's no question about that. And Canada has, Mr. Harper has gone up every summer for the last 9 summers. And I hate to tell you this, but he's made a huge number of promises, many of which have disappeared completely, some of which have been delayed, and some of which have been accomplished. But it's been more smoke and mirrors, I'm going to be political here for a second, than actual results. So Canada, if it wishes to assert its sovereignty in the Arctic, is going to have to do more than what is happening at the moment. I want to say one thing though. The big factor that is going to ultimately decide who owns what part of the Arctic is the work that's going on at the moment to chart where the undersea plateaus extend into that region. I think that international consensus will ultimately say, well, if this part of the shelf from Canada extends to here, then that will be Canadian, and similarly for the Americans because of Alaska and the Danes and the Russians. I think ultimately that will be the determining factor with respect to who owns that. Now, if that is not respected, then we have a different ballgame. But I think at the moment what is happening is a great deal of posturing, as has, I'm ex-military, as has been happening for the better part of 60 years when the Cold War started and the bear bombers started to fly over Canada or the Arctic regions. That is unfortunately a sideshow, in my opinion. I don't think that we should get ourselves too worked up about that. I think ultimately we'll discover what an international court decides belongs to each of the countries who have ambitions in the Arctic. The big question will be then, will it be respected? We won't know until that happens.
And I just totally agree with Marc's eloquent description of Arctic policy. I just want to reinforce his point about Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. And just to say two things. We are real believers in our party, and it starts with our leader, Justin Trudeau, in a team. We are putting forward a great leader, a great plan, and we hope a great team. And in working with him now, for some time, we've really experienced, he has trust in his team. Marc is our foreign policy critic. Ralph Goodale is deputy leader. I'm the international trade critic and co-chair of the Economic Advisory Council. We're senior members of the team. We're not freelancing when we put out statements on Ukraine. These are collectively agreed. We sometimes argue over every single word. These are Liberal Party policies. And it's important, for people to get that. And, frankly, when we say something, we're careful. We're careful and we're speaking for the party, and we understand that. And the second thing I would say is, Mr. Trudeau is very disciplined in terms of focusing as our leader on what is core to our message. And for him, the core message right now is the economy. So the Canadian economy. So that's where his focus is. He had a great meeting with Ukrainian community leaders in Toronto. I don't think anyone who was here Taras was there. I don't think Marc was there, Ralph Goodale was there, I was there, and he was very direct and explicit in terms of where his position is.
Hi. Boris just tapped me on the shoulder because Chrystia has to go to the airport pretty soon.
We could do one more question.
One more
One more
question? Okay.
I have to be at my kid's school tomorrow
All right,
morning,
so
so
this
I'm
man
catching the
has to be
last
right
flight
there.
to
So,
Toronto.
The question I have is recently we all received, I guess, a memo saying that former Prime Minister Chrystia had a discussion with Putin, supposedly back room, whatever. Could you enlighten us as to what the position is, and so that you can focus our attention on the right things?
I will say, and Chrystia may have a different comment to make, that Jean Chrétien, of course, is a former head of state. He gets to walk on the world stage, and he gets to sort of meet with current and former heads of state. He's very actively engaged in that, and despite the fact that he's about 80 years old, he's still 100% firing on all cylinders, and is still a very wise man. And so he went to Russia, and he had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Putin. What he spoke to Mr. Putin about is basically what he has the right to as a former head of state to discuss matters. Next week he's going to Wales and meeting with about a larger group of former heads of states. These are people who want to discuss the world situation and possibly even influence it. But those are things that he can do because he is a former head of state. He doesn't have to ask permission from anybody, and he decided to do it because of his status as somebody who was the Prime Minister of Canada for 10 years. We're not privy to those conversations. These are things that he's doing as a private citizen. But I don't want you to read into it that this was something that the Liberal Party proposed or that the government proposed. This is Mr. Chrétien acting as a private citizen by virtue of his past. Do you want to?
Yeah, no, Marc is exactly right. And, you know, that's the prerogative of former heads of state or former prime ministers. I just wanted to say 2 closing thoughts. The first is, and I really see, you know, our Hromada as very important advocates for Ukraine in Canada. It's so important for me as a Canadian politician, but also just as a Canadian, that we not allow this issue to become purely a Ukrainian-Canadian issue. That kind of ghettoization is bad for our community and it's bad for Ukraine. Something that I have noticed is a temptation of many Canadians who happen not to be Ukrainian is to see Ukraine through the prism of Canada. And we're sort of so proud of our multiculturalism, we're so proud of dealing with ethnic and cultural divides, we sort of transpose that experience onto Ukraine. That's not what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine, this is really 1989. This is really Ukraine's version of Solidarność or the Velvet Revolution. This is inside Ukraine about the Dignity Revolution, and in terms of international relations, about sovereignty, as Marc said so eloquently. And I think it's important for our community to explain that. And not, you know, because I think the Russian propaganda effort is very cunningly directed at not having that be the story. And then the final thing I just wanted to say, Marc is going to think I'm sort of overly sentimentally, romantically Ukrainian, so get ready.
I know that already.
Yeah. You know the Іван Франко poem «До великого моменту будь готовий кожен з вас, кожен може стати Богданом, як настане скучний час». This is our великий момент. You know, I think that this is a turning point in Ukrainian history, and I also personally think that what's happening in Ukraine is the most important issue in world politics right now. If Ukraine can succeed as a rule of law, prosperous, and economic prosperity is so central, democracy, that is going to change the whole picture of Europe. It is going to change Russian history. When I talk to my sort of Russian Democrat friends or Americans who've been sort of fighting for Russian democracy for 25 years, they now see the only possible path for Russian democracy as being through a successful Ukraine. And if that seems overly kind of idealistic, given where the conflict is now, think about Ukraine and Poland. You know, when I grew up, as I'm sure is the case for many people here, the big fight between my Baba and Guido, Baba was from Russian-ruled Ukraine, Guido was from Polish-ruled Ukraine. The big argument, you know, waged like every day was who oppressed us more, the Poles or the Russians, you know, who was worse? And now the Poles are our best friends. And Poland took this strategic, very difficult choice to renounce its claims on Ukraine. All that stuff the Russians say about Ukraine, the Poles could be saying too, but they're not. And so it is not, like, we have to not fall into the Putin paradigm and be able to look forward to a different vision of this part of the world. And what is really exciting for me, and I think a real opportunity for Ukrainians in Ukraine and for Ukrainian Canadians as their cousins and supporters, is if Ukraine gets things right, this will be historic for Ukraine, and it's going to be a turning point really for Europe and the whole world. So it is, you know, це є наш великий момент. I feel very privileged as an MP to have some purchase on it, and I think, you know, as a Hromada, we should be alive to that.
And I very, very quickly will say one thing. There are 2 things. First is there's an election this fall. I just want you, no, I'm not politicking, but I'm telling you that if, for whatever reason, it happens to be a Liberal government afterwards, I want to reassure you of the unwavering support of the Government of Canada for Ukraine. I want to make that clear so that you do not have any doubts in your mind. The second thing is that I would like to one day go to Ukraine and work with the Ukrainian Space Agency. I say that because I'm aware of the history of Ukraine in terms of its massive contributions to the space program, to the Soviet space program, and other programs. And I worked with the first Ukrainian astronaut to go into space when he trained in Houston, and I was there at the same time. So I would love nothing more than to be involved with working cooperatively, as Canada has worked with many space agencies over the years, but I would love nothing more than to work with the Ukrainian Space Agency. Thank you.
Speaking of social media, notice this thing here, camera, video camera. UCPBA Ottawa, we've been videotaping a lot of the demonstrations, a lot of the events over the years. It goes on YouTube, it goes on our UCPBA page. Actually, and Lada Roslicki in Kiev right now asked that we make a link to the YouTube posting of this event tonight, so they'll make use of that in Ukraine as well. See, that's how.
Dobry večer.
That's what we need to do. We need to counter a lot of the Russian propaganda on social media by doing it ourselves. And don't feel that you can't make an impact. Every little thing we do is noticed, right? You noticed, you told us that. Okay. My father, for example, is 89 years old. He goes down the basement, turns on the computer, and uses Skype to talk to his relatives in Ukraine. So if an 89-year-old Ukrainian-born immigrant can do it, I think we all can utilize it somehow, okay? So again, I'd like to thank Marc, Garneau, and Chrystia Freeland. I'd also like to thank the other P's and B's members who made this event possible: Paul Migas, Andrei Selchuk, Ron Sorabay, Zenon Domanchuk. Zenon was also Garneau's financial agent, I believe.
We're all friends. We're all friends. A very good one, too.
Right. And Boris Gangelo. So again, a round of applause, please. Now feel free to stay around. That patio's for our youth. You want to open the doors and walk outside.
Probably. Thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure. Our
Thank you for your answers.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Make it.
Thank you, sir.
Oh,
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I did. But you know, politics, they don't 15 minutes after.
Good event.
Yeah.
Nicely done.